see what's making the headlines with author and journalist Ella Whelan and Times columnist Matthew Syed. So hello to you two. So let's take a look then on what's making those front pages of the Sunday papers. And the Sunday Times features the major outbreak facing the UK, with a top virus expert claiming that coronavirus is a greater threat than Ebola, which will overwhelm the NHS. That's according to that expert. The Observer leads with an exclusive story saying the Department of Health and Social Care has been selling the medical data of millions of NHS patients to American drugs companies. PM gears up for Britain to boom is the headline on the Sunday Express as Boris Johnson prepares to launch his new infrastructure plan later this week. The Sunday Telegraph carries a similar story, saying the Prime Minister also wants to cut pension tax and impose a mansion tax on owners of expensive homes in an effort to pay for public spending. And soldier lay dead in barracks for 3 weeks, says the Sunday Mirror, as Bernard Mongan's body was found late last month. So Ella Whelan and Matthew Syed are here with me now, and a few political stories around, lots of different front pages actually there, aren't there? But you've picked out the Sunday Telegraph to kick off with, and the suggestion that Boris Johnson is going to make a few announcements to do with taxes and spending.
Yeah, it's important to note that this is all, as it were, noises coming out of the Conservative Party and suggestions. They're looking at the idea of potentially introducing or imposing a mansion tax, going to town on pensions, and what's described here in the Telegraph as a raid on capital gains, on stealth taxes and things like that. And essentially the interesting thing is, this column points out, it's almost emulating Labour in a way, or moving towards a position that Labour once took, which is, as it calls it, the politics of jealousy. So taking from that sort of very crude explanation of it, of taking from the rich to give to the poor, redistribution. The important thing, I think, is that while this might sound like the kind of thing that the Tories once criticised Labour for, as being sort of almost ultra-socialist, actually it's a process of, it's a rather more boring process of doing that kind of balancing the books thing. So the Tories on the one hand have got these massive promises of big spending on transport and infrastructure, and they're looking to how to balance it in another way and maintain their position as the party that can manage finances. So whether or not they go with something like this, I think the important thing to note is this isn't anything radically exciting actually for voters. It's obviously going to upset some of the key Tory voters on a kind of symbolic level, but in actual fact, in the way in which they should be focusing on playing to their, or listening to their voters, that newly gained voters in places like Grimsby or across the Red Wall, who aren't going to be particularly interested in this. The kind of the politics of jealousy, the grab from the rich to give to the poor, Robin Hood-esque style things, didn't work for Labour. Why would it work for the Conservatives this time around? It's a bit strange.
That's why it's I think it's a genuinely stunning political development. They definitely need money for the very ambitious infrastructure projects that we're going to come on to later in the programme. But the way they're doing it, I mean, the Ed Miliband proposal for a mansion tax in 2015 was absolutely hated by the then Conservative Party, and particularly by Conservative activists who voted for Boris Johnson in huge numbers during the Conservative leadership campaign, talked about cutting taxation. And from memory, the Ed Miliband proposal was very large levies on anybody who owns a home worth more than £3 million, but also between 2 and 3 million. And one of the problems is pensioners who live in flats that might be worth 2 million in London, but don't have a lot of cash to pay the levy. And so there were huge amounts of anomalies with this. And this, according to the Telegraph, it's not just noise. I mean, it's two separate sources have been briefing this out, and it's been discussed at a very senior level. And Johnson and Jack.
Yeah, and in the opening paragraph, they say that he's weighing it up. So it's obviously, they're not saying that he's about to announce it, but it's obviously something that's under consideration.
And I think one way he could potentially get away with it is if there was a levy or a new council tax ban for very expensive houses, if they slashed stamp duty. Stamp duty has got, I mean, when I bought my first place in 96, stamp duty for all properties was 0.5 of 1%. It now goes up to astronomical levels, and it's just meant that the volume of housing transactions has gone down, and the revenue from stamp duty has gone down too. So people are living in homes that they don't want to live in further away from the work than they want to because they're worried about having to pay this tax. If they had very significant cuts to stamp duty, I think he could potentially sell the mansion tax with his core voters, potentially.
Well, yes, and is there another issue over not just that issue of some who might be living in a property that has gained in value while they've been living in it but don't have an income, as you pointed out, many pensioners might be in that situation. That's one issue. Is there an issue about shortage of housing as well? If you don't, about building houses which could exceed that value, and the issues around that, could be deterrent to building more?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the bigger picture here is that this isn't going to, like I said, this isn't going to solve any of the broader issues of lack of housing, lack of affordable housing, or things that, if you take something in relation to pensions, I mean, the broader issue of a huge number of people who are elderly now not having a great quality of life, and you know, to do something even on a symbolic level like this sends out the wrong kind of message to people, which is that we're going after, you know, even though it's from a certain band of people who own a certain amount of money, it doesn't look good for the Tories. And as you know, the economic significance of this is limited because really it's still doing that same thing of taking a bit from here and tweaking a bit there and moving the numbers around. Whereas actually I think the exciting thing about this election was that people were willing to take quite a big gamble, both in relation to Brexit and in relation to switching to many Labour supporters switching to the Tory party. And so to do this kind of almost shallow thing of trying to emulate Labour in a way by moving towards a more, as you've put it, a more kind of, yes, radical in one way, but actually really just a process of balancing the books, isn't going to be what voters, it's not going to get voters hot on the colour, it's not going to excite them, because the outcome will not be an increase in wealth in the general round. It's just going to be about moving stuff around, and that's what they've been doing for years, so...
Well, very, very interesting to see what kind of reaction these suggestions get. Let's move on, though, to the front page of the Sunday Express. A very pro-Boris Johnson headline there. PM gears up for Britain to boom. But what's behind that headline? What are they suggesting he's going to do to generate this boom, as they put it?
Well, I mean, it's related to the last story, that he needs to raise money because he wants to spend big on a transport revolution, the biggest in some headline there since the Victorian age. So the report is he's going to go for HS2. There's going to be funding for 10 free ports. There's going to be the Northern Powerhouse Rail, massive increases in spending in local train and bus services, the rolling out of superfast 5G broadband, Crossrail 2 in London. So I think this rings true for me for two reasons. Number one, Johnson and Cummings fully grasp the significance of interconnectivity to innovation rates, something that I don't think has been fully understood by governments in the Western world for the last 25 years. The other thing is a psychological reason that Johnson, as a politician, I think likes the idea of big legacy projects that people can point to in 20 years' time and say, that was Boris's vision. So I think there could be a kernel of truth in what would be a massive change to transport and communications infrastructure. And as with people communicating more effectively, the cross-pollination of ideas, that will feed into innovation and, as a consequence, economic growth. That's their pitch.
And a big spend.
Yes, a big spend, but I think that's something to be celebrated. I think as I was saying before, for too long, we've been too mealy-mouthed about the reality of what this country needs in terms of investment and innovation. And the exciting thing is that you've got big projects like HS2, which we've been rowing about for years now, and it's just the most ridiculous thing to consider that this could have been done in so many different, more efficient ways, and we've been rowing about it. The idea that he would do not just HS2, but hopefully HS3, HS4, more projects like that. It doesn't matter if he does it in line of his own desire to have a legacy project, as long as they get done in tandem with the smaller, less headline-grabbing projects like increasing bus services in places like Grimsby or things like that, and making sure that train lines run in that interconnected way. The interesting thing is that this largely goes against the general, this is the interesting thing about Cummings and Johnson together, is that it goes against the tide of people being fearful about having these kind of big projects for things like climate change, the patterns of NIMBYism, as it's called, which was a big barrier to HS2, not in my backyard, people being reluctant to, rip up ground and lay new train tracks and do all that kind of thing. It looks like Cummings is got a word in Johnson's ear to say, ignore all that and just push for it, because this is actually what voters, to keep coming back to the red wall aspect of it, it is what voters in that parts of the UK really want.
I mean, I agreed with most of that. I mean, there's two risks that are worth pointing out. One is when there are very big increases in public expenditure, there can be a lot of waste. We saw that in the Labour government under Tony Blair. Contractors start putting their prices up, raw materials get bid up, people think they can take... Cronyism can potentially come in. I think that is a risk when you start making these big public spending announcements if it isn't linked to a great deal of rationality about how that money is spent. I can't remember what the second thing was.
Well, let me just pose a question then. This obviously would be a big step away from austerity, wouldn't it? This amount of spending. Where does public opinion lie now on this idea of spending? Because obviously after the economic crash, after 2008, people were concerned about government spending too much and not having money to fix the roof when the rain came in. So where is public opinion now on whether or not government should spend big?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that austerity wasn't popular, and it's pretty clear that people are delighted that era has ended, or has it ended? That will be a question for the upcoming years of whether or not the Tories managed to pull it off. It's also true that the Labour Party's, inverted commas, radical promises of huge lump sums of spending didn't resonate with voters. I think not because people are scared of actually investing in what the country needs, but because they seem to be these shallow things like ridiculous promises on broadband, essentially payouts to voters that people saw as bribes and things like that. It didn't have the right tone to it. If voters can see that it's actually going into things that are going to not just make their daily lives better, but actually excel the economy. So having interconnecting trains between regions, which would promote more jobs, opening up not just in infrastructure and transport, but funds for research and innovation. If you can see a future to it, then it's much more easy to bring people politically along with this. The point is people have to feel part of this political process. And to a certain extent, cautiously, I think that the Tories are managing to get that right if they're going to have gone through on these promises.
And of course,
I still haven't remembered the second thing.
No, don't worry at all. I'm impressed you remembered one. I don't really remember one point. So anyway, there will be no doubt a backlash if HS2 does go ahead, because there's still plenty of people who have all sorts of concerns, aren't there? But we'll hear about those, I'm sure, if it does come to be. Let's move on and fit in one more story before the break, and that is inside the Express. Long Bailey is left in the cold. So this is focusing on the Labour leadership.
The Labour leadership. And the question is, can the Labour Party elect a leader who could potentially win in the general election? I think some of these candidates are quite impressive. Sir Keir Starmer, I think, is a credible candidate. He's obviously burnishing his left-wing credentials because he needs to get the votes of the Labour core.
Toolmaker's son.
Exactly, I saw that. But Rebecca Long Bailey, I think, is beginning to wane, because Lisa Nandy, who has impressed in the hustings, a lot of people have said that she's come across extremely well. A lot of the second preference votes are going to go to her, and this might mean that Rebecca Long Bailey, who's of course the anointed successor of Jeremy Corbyn, considered the most... A lot of people have said that she's come across extremely well. A lot of the second preference votes are going to go to her, and this might mean that Rebecca Long Bailey, who's of course the anointed successor of Jeremy Corbyn, considered the most left-wing of the candidates, might not get onto the final two.
And we've still got a way to go, haven't we?
We still have a way to go.
April the 4th, I think, that we find out.
Oh, is it that long?
But I mean, some things have changed and some things haven't. Keir Starmer is still very much, at the top of the league. Someone like Emily Thornberry is still very much at the bottom. And this interesting interplay between Nandy and Rebecca Long Bailey, because actually they are quite different. Lisa Nandy doesn't have the same politics as Rebecca Long Bailey, isn't as wedded to the Corbyn aspect of politics and that continuity or legacy question. She sees herself as quite different to that. The question is, what does the Labour Party need? I'm not particularly interested in maintaining the Labour Party. As a party, I think it needs to split or reform or change itself. Nandy, as someone who gets, even if it's possibly cynical, gets the Brexit question more than any of the other candidates, I think has that opportunity to resonate with voters, because Rebecca Long-Bailey, Keir Starmer, and certainly Emily Thornberry are still in la-la land when it comes to Brexit. They won't admit that they were
Well, that's some of the reasons why the base don't like Starmer, because he was responsible for
Remainer,
Labour's Brexit policy during the election, even though he wasn't really on the stump that much defending it, but he was definitely the person behind it.
Okay, that race, as we say, still got a way to go, but this half hasn't. It's time for a break. Coming up after the break, UK faces major outbreak, warns top virus expert. That's the lead story in the Sunday Times. We're going to be talking about that next. Story in this section. I just want to bring our viewers a little bit of breaking news, because the latest figures regarding the number of deaths down to coronavirus have just been given to us, and they are at 805 deaths globally. Now, the significance of that figure is it does mean that the number of people to have died from coronavirus now exceeds the number who died from the SARS virus, which was 774 deaths globally. And in fact, that does lead us into the first subject that you wanted to talk about in this section, which is on the front page of the Sunday Times. Their main story: UK faces major, in inverted commas, outbreak, warns top virus expert.
Yeah, I worry a lot about this. So the expert they've interviewed is Peter Pyatt, director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And the 2 points that he is making is that the serious risk associated with this virus is the transmission rate is much faster than SARS, so your chance of infecting other people who then infect other people is higher. But this in conjunction with a long incubation period, so there could be people who have the virus who are not yet displaying symptoms, who therefore haven't gone to get medically checked out, who aren't in isolation, who are potentially infecting other people. And he thinks that this won't peak till late February, potentially March. And the other concern is that the NHS, I mean, if this does become a serious problem, if it becomes a pandemic and we're part of that, then the NHS will be in a very difficult position, because it won't be able to cope with the influx of cases and the requirement for all the infrastructure that needs to go around them. So, yeah, it's a pretty severe warning, and I think a legitimate front page headline.
Well, yes, and up until now we have been told, haven't we, that all the measures are in place that can be in place, given the situation in China. And at the moment, 3 confirmed cases in this country. I think there are Brits in other parts of the world who have been confirmed to have it, but in this country, just 3 at the moment. But there are still so many questions, aren't there, Ella? And that's the problem here.
Yes. On one hand, you know, the quarantine in Wirral as an example of something that I think the NHS and authorities have dealt with very well, that seems to be reassuring. You know, there are processes in place. They've reacted quickly. Obviously, there's a broader question about the fact that we've discussed many times in this paper review that the NHS is in dire straits, and so there's that feeling you have at the back of your head where you think it's, you know, it takes enough time for me to get to see my GP when I've got a virus that isn't deadly, let alone actually being dealt with this. So there's that question. There's also difficult things like, you know, I've seen an increase of people on the tube wearing masks and surgical masks and things like that, which is a frightening sight. But actually, there's a huge amount of health experts coming out and saying this doesn't protect you at all, and actually it's doing that is kind of stoking up fear, but also giving yourself a false sense of security in that you are protected when you're not. I mean, the other aspect of this, which is putting aside the terrible and tragic fact that people are dying in their hundreds, the other aspect of it is, of course, the fact that if China does go into a lockdown, and we're not going to have anything to do with anything that comes out of that country, including things that are manufactured there that come over here. There's plans here that the Sunday Times goes into to institute a no-deal style scenario with which we end all relations with China on a temporary basis for this epidemic slows down. And, you know, what does that mean for the economy? Or there's massive amount of questions come out of this. This isn't, yes, it's do you call it a humanitarian crisis? It's a terrible crisis on the basis of people's lives, but it will also have a huge amount of an effect of going forward China's relationship with the rest of the world.
Yeah, but there is another, just very quickly, there's just an incredible story just below that one in the Sunday Times. about heroic doctors who are working 12-hour shifts without using a bathroom break because they can't, because they might get infected by taking the suit off. And they're also, some of them, because they've run out of protective clothing, they are going in without it. And it's just incredible work that they're doing.
I'm going to cut you off only because we need to get to the weather, because there's some wild and weather coming, so we're going to give people details. But for the moment, Matthew and Ella, thank you.
When she said she gave Corbyn's campaign 10 out of 10 at the general election, which Labour lost by a historic landslide.
Okay, well, a few more weeks left to see. April the 4th, I think it is, that we get the results.
She did say that. It was a bit of a silly question, but it showed that kind of ridiculous loyalty that I think people think. I have to say that if Sir Keir Starmer gets it, I think Labour's doomed because he, he's a safe pair of hands. All of this kind of stuff. He's dull. He was the arch Remainer, and he has that sense of being he has that sense of the sneering disdain for people in the north that we've been talked about. I mean, if Keir Starmer wins it, I'll laugh.
Okay. Well, because there it is down there at the bottom. Yeah.
Who are working, night and day, but 12-hour shifts because they can't take off these protective. This isn't the pandemic yet, but could well become one. But also the incubation period is longer, so you can have people who are manifesting no symptoms, but nevertheless are carrying the virus, who then might be infecting other people, and that could increase the number of people who have it. There's a story a little bit lower down about these remarkable doctors in Wuhan.
Yeah, we might be able to bring the whole page up if we can, because there it is down there at the bottom. Yeah.
Who are working night and day, but 12-hour shifts because they can't take off these protective suits to eat or use a bathroom because otherwise they may get infected. And some of them, because they've run out of protective suits, are going in and working without it because they care about their patients. And of course, the person who raised the alarm but wasn't listened to, I don't think, by the Chinese authorities, a doctor, a hero, passed away because he was so keen to engage with these people who needed his help. And when you think about the people in isolation units in this country and the NHS staff who are working with them, must be incredibly stressful. And, I just think that we should acknowledge that many of these public sector workers who don't earn a huge amount of money, but are heroic in the way that they care for people who need their care.
Absolutely, and there will be concerns for the NHS should it spread. At the moment, a small number of cases here, but there will be concerns, obviously. At the moment, they're saying they've got all the measures in place. Should there be more cases in this country. But let's move on, shall we? Because we've got a couple of stories to try and squeeze in and not a huge amount of time. Front page of The Observer, they also have coronavirus on their front page there, but the picture story is the one that you wanted to talk about now.
Yes, I mean I'm grabbing the picture, but it's a theatre group called BP or Not BP, which is an organisation. It looks a bit like, I'm not sure if it is the same group, but it looks a bit like the groups that were in theatre groups in Extinction Rebellion. And this group is protesting at the British Museum because it's funded by BP. And
so one particular exhibition is?
Yes, at the moment. And so they're on the basis of arguments about climate change, suggesting that they should pull the funding and reject it. It's a wider discussion. Protesting at the British Museum because it's funded by BP. And
so one particular exhibition is?
Yes, at the moment. And so they're on the basis of arguments about